So should you be consuming carbohydrates? Some people are saying you can consume up to 500 grams of carbohydrates per day. Some people are saying you shouldn't consume any carbohydrates because the body doesn't need carbs, and that we can make our own glucose, so we don't need to be ingesting any glucose. And basically some people are just demonizing all sources of sugar. So what is the truth? And the truth is it depends. Some people who have elevated blood glucose levels or insulin or are pre-diabetic or have type 2 diabetes probably need to consume, for at least a little while, a low amount of carbohydrates until they become more carbohydrate tolerant. Whereas someone who is muscular, who is more active, can obviously tolerate more carbohydrates, and that can, in many cases, give them more energy, help with their workouts, etc. So it depends. I like to take sort of the approach of, well, in what population, what type of carbohydrate, how much, and how are you consuming it? All of those things, yes, it makes it a more nuanced discussion, but it is important because that is what real life is. It is nuanced. So we shouldn't just be demonizing natural sources of sugar like orange juice just because it contains sugar. Because if you're someone who is metabolically flexible, you are active, and you consume, let's say, freshly squeezed orange juice, 3 or 4 ounces, after a protein meal, even 2 to 3 times a day, that could be a good thing. Whereas, someone who's type 2 diabetic might not want to have any juice at all because their bodies currently they're not carb tolerant. So it depends on the patient population, the type of carbohydrate, how you're consuming that carbohydrate as well. So it's a very nuanced discussion. I think that for someone who is metabolically flexible, someone who is healthy, who has a low amount of body fat, who has a good blood glucose control, I think a baseline of around 130 grams of carbs is probably, that's what I do. For me, that feels good. And then I will add 30 grams of carbs to that for every hour of moderate intensity exercise I do that day, or 60 grams if I do an hour of vigorous exercise. So if I'm active, where I'm doing 60 minutes or an hour of vigorous exercise activity, I'll probably hit 180 grams of whole food carbohydrates for that day. And I feel better. My exercise performance is better. My energy levels are better. And we do know that some people don't do well on low or no carb diets. Their thyroid hormone can go down, cortisol can go up because they are trying to break down amino acids for the glucose that their brain demands. Your brain needs about 130 grams of glucose. And yes, you can make glucose to do that, but that can be stressful for some people because the body will have to increase cortisol and adrenaline to break down those amino acids to form glucose. So it can be a stressful situation for some people, whereas some people actually feel great consuming no carbohydrate. So again, do what works for you. And we need to think about this in a much more nuanced discussion rather than just demonizing all forms of sugar or demonizing orange juice just because it contains a lot of sugar. I mean, there's a big difference between consuming, let's say, 3 ounces of freshly squeezed orange juice after a protein meal versus slamming 12 or 16 ounces of orange juice. And there's a huge difference too in someone who is type 2 diabetic that does that versus someone who is an athlete that does that. So I personally believe that for people who are metabolically flexible and healthy, that consuming some carbohydrates is healthy, and that still limiting refined carbohydrates and refined sugars is important. I do think that if you overconsume, especially in bolus doses, even just table sugar, that can lead to an increase in inflammation and cortisol, etc. So we do have to be careful with the type of sugar and how much we're consuming in one sitting and how often. And that will also depend on the person's baseline carbohydrate tolerance. So in the end, I don't think we should demonize carbohydrates. I think carbohydrates can be actually very healthy. I think carbohydrates are important, especially on a high animal protein diet, to offset the acid load. And I think that the approach that I take is, if you are someone who is consuming a lot of carbs, you got to make sure the fat amount in your diet is low. If you're consuming a lot of fat, you need to make sure the carbohydrate intake is low. Because when you're burning a lot of one fuel, the other fuel, due to the Randall cycle, doesn't get burned very well. So, but I take the approach of I don't do either. I don't consume high fat and I don't consume high carb. I actually consume high protein, high animal protein, and moderate to low carb, moderate fat. And that actually works best for me. But everyone's different. I'm fairly active. I have a fair amount of muscle. I do lift weights, and I do play, do a lot of cardio, play basketball. I run a decent amount, so I have good metabolic flexibility. So that's where I feel the best. So what it really comes down to is do what works for you.